Hello and welcome back to another Sigma Max investment video. So today I have a long list of books that I want to talk about, and these are going to be my list of books that young men should be reading in 2025 in order to create generational wealth. And I'm not joking when I say this, I genuinely believe we're in a historic period of time. Things aren't what they have been for the past few decades or throughout history. I've talked about this in my first video, but I've discussed the stock market and how I believe there's a massive bubble in terms of tech, and then most importantly, the national debt in the US and other countries and how it's almost unmanageable. And I don't see many ways to for governments to go out solving this except to print money. And based on this, I'm going to talk about some books that should be able to counter this and be able to create opportunities to actually create wealth for individuals if done correctly. So to start off, I want to talk about this book. It's called The Price of Time, and it's by Edward Chancellor. It's a must read in my opinion. I read it in November 24. But basically, he just discusses a lot of what I've talked about. The massive debt crisis, populations and how they're aging. There's not enough workforce. How something that people forget about is how social security pensions. How are we going to pay this? With inflation, with high inflation, that's going to affect a lot of fixed asset security. So people who receive a yield on their pensions, bonds, something like that, they're going to be heavily affected by high inflation, to the point where they may be making a negative real return, which is going to it's going to affect the economy, and it's going to be really bad for a lot of people. So I think this is a must-read book. It's not too long, 300 odd pages. It's an easy read. I definitely recommend this. Give it a read. It's worth your time. The next book I have here is called The Creature from Jekyll Island. So this is all about the Federal Reserve. It's a long book. It took me a while to get through lots of detail, but it's very insightful. The way it was a bit shady, the way the Federal Reserve was set up. A lot of bankers who wanted to keep, JP Morgan, people like them back in the day, they wanted to keep their hold on the banking system, and the Federal Reserve seemed like a way to do that. So, this book kind of explains the reason the Federal Reserve was created, to manage unemployment, inflation, things like that, and that they basically haven't been able to do that. Since it was created, the dollar has lost about 99% of its value. So, from that standpoint, they've failed. But yeah, it's a really good book. Definitely recommend it. I heard about this one through a guy called Chris McIntosh. He did a podcast or something on YouTube. He runs a fund and has a newsletter, so definitely recommend this. Give it a read. The next book I have here is called Woke Incorporated by Vivek Ramaswamy, a US politician. I think it's a great book. It kind of just goes over the current ESG social justice movement in American business, and how due to these there's a lot of opportunities to make money in sectors that are maybe frowned upon. So in historically, gambling, tobacco, stocks like these, defense, they were seen as you don't want to invest in them, they're socially bad. And that's kind of how oil, coal, a lot of mining stocks have been treated these days, and due to that they can often be undervalued, and there's a lot of return for outside returns compared to the rest of the market. So definitely a good read. I recommend it. Again, not too long. Next one I have here, Art of Contrary Thinking by Humphrey B. Neal. This is an absolute classic. You 100% have to read this. I mean, look at this. It's not long at all. Very, very short, very easy read. But you know, at the end of the day, we have to be thinking differently from other people in order to make outsized returns and compete at a higher level. So to do this, you have to look at what other people are not looking at. So, you know, we do this all the time in the stock market. For an example, uranium investing. Who's looking at uranium investing? If I talk to, you know, a random guy on the street, they know about Nvidia, Apple, Tesla, things like this. They wouldn't know what uranium is, what it does, you know, anything about it. This is what I mean. You have to be thinking about things differently from other people. I love this book when he talks about going into a bookshop like Barnes and Nobles in America, something like that, Waterstones in the UK. And he goes to the business section and it's all the same books. You know, everybody is reading the same books, and you're never going to get ahead if you're taking in the same information. To create outsized returns, you have to either have other information or analyze information differently. By reading books like this, we're taking in other information, learning new habits, and then we can also analyze, you know, information we see differently from other people in the markets. That's another thing. But yeah, definitely recommend this book. It's a good read, short, read it. The Intelligent Investor, the definitive book of value investing by Benjamin Graham. You know, this was by far the best book on investing ever written, according to Warren Buffett. You know, and he's one of the best investors that has ever lived. You know, he's worth more than 100 billion. You have to read this book. You know, this one was gifted to me by my granddad, and it's pretty beaten up. I've read it a couple times, you know, lots of notes, lots of highlighting, but it just gives, for people who are unfamiliar with value investing, if you're new to it, read this first. You know, you got to understand this. It talks about how a lot of this is just psychology. You know, for example, I love when they talk about how just before a lot of crashes, they'll, you know, if you look at the newspaper headlines for business or stock newsletters, and they'll be the complete opposite of what's about to happen. You know, they'll say bull market will never stop and it will crash within the next week or two, you know, things like this. You have to read this book to understand what we're doing here on this channel. Lastly, I have here a book called Riches Among the Ruins by Robert P. Smith. And this book basically talks about the travels of a guy and his whole career around the global economy. You know, he's had a lot of life or death situations, like in El Salvador. I recall he was there doing something, trading with bonds, sovereign bonds there. Yeah, you know, it just shows that we're often centric to our home country, you know, UK, US, Australia, people are home centric. But there's a lot of opportunities out there, and often these opportunities are far superior than the ones we'll find at home. We just have to open our eyes a little bit. You know, I'm going to do a video on, you know, different economies. I like to screen a lot of these through Koyfin, you know, find interesting stocks. I was looking the other day at Poland. I'll do some on that. But yeah, definitely, you know, it's less actionable, this book, but it just kind of widens your eyes as to what's out there. I believe I found this book through Harris Kupperman, Cuppy, Praetorian Capital. He's got a newsletter, and like he's got a reading list on there. Found this, thought it looked interesting, and definitely worth a read. So with that, everybody, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll update this again at some point. You know, this is just a few books, but I just want to say something is that you have to be reading. You know, all the most successful people in the world, it doesn't matter what they do, the one thing I'd say they all have in common is they read. You know, you can listen to any successful person, they'll say this, because it's about taking in information and learning. You know, as Socrates says, the wisest person is the person who knows what they do not know. And if you do not know something, you have to learn what you don't know. So as long as you, sounds it's all a bit confusing, but you know, learn something new basically, and then you'll be able to get ahead. With that, thank you for watching, and please subscribe. I'd appreciate it. I'm going to grow this channel again, as I said, massively. I'm going to create a massive community. You know, big things are coming, guys. Big things are coming. Take care. Bye.